Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Tuesday, June 23rd informational meeting. We will call this meeting to order and get started with any City Council open discussion. Councilors? Councillor Erickson?
I will be brief. We had our Municipal League Board meeting today via Zoom. Had a fairly short meeting. One of the things that did come out of it is the conference that's supposed to be in September will be canceled as of now. We will have some sort of modified version because we have to have a business meeting per the charter, business rules, whatever it's called, to ensure that we still check that box. One of the things that the Municipal League is looking at for direction from the city of Sioux Falls, as well as other cities that are members, is really the position that they will take on the initiated measures in regards to marijuana, whether it's recreational or medical, and how those are written. A decision was not made today by the Municipal League, but we did discuss it, and we'll make some sort of recommendation for the league. So if you've got some burning desire one way or another, I'd encourage you to reach out to myself or Yvonne Taylor with the board to discuss that. The last item I just wanted to mention is our Spark group met again this morning. We had another webinar in regards to our industry cluster of health and biotech. It was very interesting talking about pharmaceuticals, where they're manufactured, how it impacts through COVID, and really the impact it's had on Sioux Falls, as well as having Joni on talk about biotech and really the opportunities that have been created here. With many newsletters that she sends out, a lot of the other communities are looking at Sioux Falls for opportunity because we've done things right. And I think that you could see some additional new business and also really just having people come to South Dakota for some different opportunities that exist and don't exist in other cities. And so that was really interesting. Today we had about 45 folks on the line. It will be on the YouTube Spark video again, and you will see the process rolling out of get out there and really creating that consumer confidence in Sioux Falls and starting to see some of these events take place. So that's just kind of a quick little Spark update. We will meet again Thursday, but as always, reach out to anybody that's on that committee, and we're happy to provide any feedback and dialogue. It's been a really good process of engaging the public with these meetings. That's all I've got.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other open discussion today? Anybody on the phone have anything for open discussion? All right, if not, we will move into our presentations and start out with by inviting the mayor to come up and give his presentation of the capital program.
All right, thank you, Marshall. Thank you, Council. Well, good afternoon. I present to the Council and residents of Sioux Falls my administration's proposal for the City of Sioux Falls 5-year capital program covering 2021 through 2025. Presentation of the capital program is our first step of the 2021 budget process and establishes the vision for how our city will invest in the critical infrastructure needs of this community over the next several years. While the last several months have presented significant challenges for the community and the nation as a whole, the financial strength of the city, nurtured over decades of sensible decision-making, has positioned us to react and overcome crisis with resiliency and with strength. The unity demonstrated by our residents and businesses over the past year as we've responded to local and global challenges is a defining quality of Sioux Falls and a reflection of our city's civic strength, a term I'm going to come back to later on, civic strength. Our team prioritized the investments in the proposed capital program through listening and through adapting. While our infrastructure demands continue to grow and evolve, We held true to an overarching yet principled approach under the One Sioux Falls framework. And as we look beyond the horizon to Sioux Falls' future, we will continue to make decisions that ensure Sioux Falls remains a great place to live, work, and to raise a family. The capital program and the forthcoming 2021 budget proposal embraces the One Sioux Falls approach, uniting and focusing our efforts to engage people, support public safety and health, promote accessible housing, and develop a workforce that grows our economy. We will continue to do this through foundational growth and investments in essential infrastructure while promoting innovation through technology and strategic community partnerships. We must innovate government to do more with less, recognizing that limited resources necessitate thoughtful prioritization of needs and strategic investments that maximize value for our community. Within the proposed capital program, our team has taken a deliberate approach to balancing the demands of maintaining our existing assets and developing new infrastructure that serves as the foundation for our city's growth. The program brought forward today, along with the city's 2021 budget proposal coming forward in July, affirms our commitment to these values. The first year of the capital program will be incorporated into the 2021 proposed budget. And the capital program component generally represents 30 to 35% of the total budget of our city. While the COVID-19 pandemic has created a pause in many sectors of our economy, it's important to not lose sight of the long-term trajectory that our community has been on for the past 70 years. Since 1940, Sioux Falls has grown nearly 8 times its size and grown its population from 41,000 to more than 190,000 people today. Projection success suggest our community will grow over 50% its present size in the next 20 years. A strong and calculated approach through the One Sioux Falls framework will guide wise investments to support the needs of our community over the next 25 to 50 years. The capital program focuses on investments in infrastructure in all sections of the community that will support economic and community development for future generations. The decision that this council makes through the budget process will form the foundation for this growth, not just for us, but for our children and for their families. The degree of our success will not be measured in the near term, but rather in the way future generations look back and assess whether we made smart, thoughtful, and careful decisions that establish a strong foundation for the future. In a 24-hour news cycle dominated by negative headlines, we must not lose sight that Sioux Falls still has a strong economic foundation. We all play a role in rebuilding confidence to support our local businesses and the local economy. While national unemployment numbers spiked over the past 3 months, South Dakota continues to have the lowest insured unemployment rate in the nation. We are consistently recognized as a city that is favorable for job growth and best positioned to be as recession-proof as possible. The capital program plays a primary role in supporting the foundation for economic growth by detailing the city's plans for investments in roads, buildings, equipment, utilities, and other parks and cultural amenities. As you know, the general fund, I just had to really emphasize that point because it was a very good one. As you know, the general fund is different in that it allocates funding for our day-to-day operating expenses. Now more than ever, it's important for us to dig deep in our efforts to invest in the community in a way that other communities do not have the financial capacity to execute. We have the opportunity to adapt and progress because we have been made financially responsible. The One Sioux Falls framework continues to provide a clear roadmap for that, to guide us forward in our prioritization of projects. And investing in foundational growth is critical to the resilience, sustainability, and vitality of our city. A large part of our capital program remains focused on supporting that foundational growth by investing nearly 85% of the entire capital program in investments to utility infrastructure, as well as rebuilding and expanding our street system. We will continue our commitments to cultural and recreational amenities, public safety, and our local transit system. A majority of our funding for capital projects is generated through the second penny sales tax, which supports about 39% of the capital expenditures incorporated into this 5-year capital plan. We have seen pressure on reduced sales tax receipts recently due to the current economic disruption. While we have had to adjust back our estimates for sales tax growth in the near term, we continue to expect steady growth over the long term. We have scaled back growth estimates for 2020 to be break even. As a result, we've had to reduce $11 million from the first 4 years of the capital program compared to last year's 5-year capital program. We've had to make tough choices and prioritize projects that maximize the return on investment for our taxpayers and balance the diverse needs of our community. The total capital program encompasses many funds, including all of our enterprise utilities. But the largest fund is the Sales and Use Tax Fund, which supports the city's investments in streets, parks, public safety, and other key governmental services. Over the next 5 years, we continue to prioritize investments in our street infrastructure, our city's largest asset. But we also recognize that investments in quality of life amenities, like our parks and bike trails, those ensure we have a vibrant community that people want to live in and raise their families. The 5-year capital plan was developed to ensure balance between these commitments. One of the most visible investments in our community over the past year will be the planned Community Bond 2020, part of which will be invested in the Public Safety Training Facility. This also includes the replacement of the Metro 911 facility that has simply outgrown its current space. The recent flood and tornado events of the past year highlighted the critical need to build a new Metro 911 center, ensuring that we can support the growth of our community and provide reliable redundancy for 911 service. We're in the final stages of detailing the cost estimates for the public safety training facility, and we'll be working with the council in the next several months to bring forward Community Bond 2020. The anticipated debt service associated with the bond has been included in this proposed capital plan. The city's investment in the public safety training facility has been a discussion for many years. When I took office in 2018, it was clear that this investment had been put off long enough. This project is more than an investment in physical infrastructure, it is an investment in people. The men and women serving as our frontline public safety personnel will be provided with real-life training in this facility, equipping them with the resources and support to react with excellence in high-stress crisis events. We ask and expect our public safety personnel to respond quickly and appropriately. Our responsibility is to ensure that they have the resources to train effectively and not only ensure our safety, but also their own. Public safety is a key component of the One Sioux Falls framework and will continue to be a priority for my administration. In fact, I can think of no other time when it is more vital for us to make this investment than probably right now. In addition to investing in public safety through Community Bond 2020, we will advance our investment in downtown with the expansion of the River Greenway. In Phase 3 of this long-term community initiative, we will see build-out of the west bank of the Big Sioux River in downtown, from Kiwanis Park on the south to Falls Park on the north. Under both the leadership of Mayors Munson and Huther, past investments into the River Greenway have led to a resurgence of economic growth and private investment along the Big Sioux River. Over the past decade, we have seen this investment become a hub for cultural activities and a gathering space for all residents to enjoy. The investment into the Phase 3 improvements will clean up years of neglect along the riverfront and will provide greater connectivity to our city's namesake park and regional tourism hub. This public sector investment will serve as a catalyst to the long-awaited redevelopment of the Sioux Steel property and demonstrates the importance of the public and private sectors working together toward an aligned vision for Sioux Falls. The transformational changes to the skyline and riverfront through these investments will shape and guide our success for generations to follow. In addition to the important investments along the riverbank, improvements to the Lowhead Dam at the top of the falls in the Big Sioux River will also be included. This will ensure that future generations have the opportunity to enjoy the river and the Upper Falls Reach. While many residents in Sioux Falls likely do not know that this Lowhead Dam even exists, its importance is great since it was originally constructed in the early 1900s and is used in maintaining the river flow throughout downtown. Over the past 100 years, this dam has generated debris and deteriorated to the point where replacement is necessary. While this portion of the River Greenway project may not have high visibility, it's important to maintaining the river cannot be understated. The COVID pandemic has tested our city's financial preparedness and long-term approach to building reserves, while also still responsibly taking on debt to make investments that will lead our community forward. As we have illustrated in the past, Sioux Falls maintains the lowest debt level of any of our peers. At the end of 2019, our debt was $1,757 per capita, nearly half of many of our other peer communities. When we have bonded in the past, we have kept our loan terms short, ensuring that we pay down debt quickly so we can continue to invest and not burden future generations. Possibly the most discussed project during my administration in the past 2 years has been the expansion and rehabilitation of the city's wastewater system and treatment facility. While it may not be a project that is top of mind to the average Sioux Falls resident, it is the largest infrastructure investment in the history of our city and will serve our growing community and region for decades. The importance of this project not only to each individual resident, but also to expanding businesses and future economic opportunities cannot be emphasized enough. Without this foundational investment, sustaining our current population, along with keeping pace with the growth of the city and region, would not be feasible. As we move through the conceptual design and construction phases of this project, our team will continue to provide key updates to the council and to the public. An investment that may be more visible to our residents is the bike trail. It's one of my favorite assets of our city. The vision of past community leaders to invest in our parks and bike trail system has not simply created community amenities, but also a foundation to the social, economic, and mental health of Sioux Falls. Parks and recreation services are often cited as one of the most important factors in surveys reflecting the livability of communities. We've seen this firsthand in the past several months as our parks served as an outlet to residents, including myself, and sometimes my family when I can get them off the couch, but it's been hard. But I've been out there a lot. In this capital plan, we're starting the first phase of expanding Sioux Falls bike network in northwest Sioux Falls in the Cherry Creek Trail Corridor. Councillor Neitzer, you've been a big champion of this. The proposed improvements will add another mile of trail starting at 12th Street and Legacy Park, going north to Connect Family Park, an on-street bike route at Songbird Street and to the neighborhood. This much anticipated extension of the bike trail will not only connect these parks and neighborhoods, but also further connect us as a community by offering equity of access to the bike trails within this area of Sioux Falls. From Terrace Park to All Saints to the Whittier Neighborhood, these core neighborhoods of Sioux Falls are full of our city's history. These neighborhoods have older homes and infrastructure. In the Whittier neighborhood, just east of downtown here, aging wood utility poles unfortunately create challenges for neighborhood residents with maintenance and upkeep. In the Whittier neighborhood, we'll be investing $350,000 in new infrastructure for electricity in a 5-block area. The aging wood poles and wires streaming through backyards make it difficult to reach for repair work. To improve reliability and improve safety, we're placing wires underground, allowing us to remove the wooden poles. And this will be a transformational project for this neighborhood. And it highlights how we're making investments in an equitable manner across our community. Beyond quality of life improvements within our neighborhoods, we're also investing in the roads that run through them and across our city. Street infrastructure and the condition of our streets has been a priority of my administration since I started in office. The capital program invests a higher portion of the sales and use tax to street construction and maintenance than it did on average over the last decade. We've started that commitment in 2020, and we're continuing it going forward. In 2020, we are currently investing $48.3 million in road construction projects. That includes investing in larger arterial projects and smaller neighborhood projects. The city's street system is our largest single asset, valued at more than $1 billion. From the survey in the Sioux Falls Long-Range Transportation Plan, we know that investing more in roadway improvements is a top priority for our residents. And we've listened. As traffic continues to grow along with our population, we've been investing in the construction and rehabilitation of our streets in the most cost-effective ways. What we are doing today is setting us up again for future growth. We'll continue to prioritize investments in our roadway network in this 5-year capital plan. These investments we've made in our roads are paying off. The city's street network once again received a pavement management score of 70, which exceeds the national average for our overall roadway network. We've consistently invested in the rehabilitation and reconstruction and addition of new streets. This has helped us to keep our rating high, the same as it was in 2015. Thanks to our investments in our street system, the backlog of streets that we have that are rated either poor or very poor has stayed the same at just 4% of our roads. These results reflect the importance of consistent, long-term investments in our streets. We'll share the full results of this IMS study with the council here in July. Our street rehabilitation program, so it's not just new streets, we do a lot of rehab projects focused on extending the life of the streets in a cost-effective way. These proposed blocks show our plans to maintain and improve our street quality. Our rehabilitation programs do the heavy lifting in effectively maintaining our current pavement condition costs. We're also investing in our arterial roads, focusing on projects that provide better traffic flow and safety as the city continues to grow. Our main roadway expansion projects identified in this 5-year plan will open doors for further expansion and development that will allow us to keep pace with projected traffic increases that come along with simply being a growing city. The new proposed 85th and I-29 interchange is identified in the 2045 Long-Range Transportation Plan as a key for Southwest Sioux Falls to better access the interstate and to expand our existing east-west arterial street network. Residents surveyed in the plan identified the preservation of our east-west routes as a top priority. The new interchange will further open the door to major economic growth and development for the region. This is a complex partnership, a collaboration and multi-jurisdictional effort between the City of Sioux Falls, the City of T, Lincoln County, South Dakota DOT, Sioux Falls MPO, Federal Highway Administration, multiple landowners. We are working on completing the final design, and construction will start in 2022. Right, Mark? Okay. We're also making improvements to Arrowhead Parkway, one of our primary east-west routes running through the heart of the city. With the connection of Veterans Parkway to Interstate 90, planned for this December 2020, this area will have new interstate access, allowing for new land use opportunities. Today, Arrowhead Parkway, from Veterans Parkway to 6 Mile Road, carries almost 10,000 vehicles per day. But looking ahead to 2045, more than 20,000 vehicles per day will travel this stretch of road. Additional capacity is needed. A deteriorating surface and poor sightlines at the intersection of 6 Mile Road and Arrowhead are the driving forces behind this project. During our public input process, residents were in support of realigning the 6 Mile intersection to address these sight and safety concerns. The project will have 2 phases. In 2021, we will reconstruct and widen the 6 Mile Road and Arrowhead Parkway intersection. This will be the main detour for the 2023 project of reconstructing the Veterans Parkway and Arrowhead Parkway intersection. We're also working on improving safety along 41st Street on one of the busiest interchanges in the entire state. The South Dakota DOT and the city are coordinating on the design and construction of 41st Street from Marion Road to Shirley Avenue. We've got a great visual on screen that shows you the changes that will be happening there. This is an exciting project with several components. We're widening 41st Street to 6 lanes with a center median and adding turn lanes in all directions. We'll also widen the current interchange bridge to add additional lanes and a new type of interchange. The current interchange will be converted into what's called a diverging diamond interchange, as you see on the screen. This is an innovative design that helps improve safety and mobility based on how left turn lanes are handled. Construction on this innovative project will begin in 2022. As I shared in May during the State of the City address, Sioux Falls continues to stand out in 3 specific ways: our financial stewardship, our economic strength, and the heart of our community. These 3 things combined is what makes our city strong. While we have faced challenges both as a community and as a nation over the past several months, we must not lose sight of what makes this city strong. Focusing on our strengths will continue to help us to move forward. We're making very thoughtful investments here toward the future, guided by that One Sioux Falls framework, in maintaining our current assets while developing new infrastructure. The focuses of safety, shelter, employment, and people within that framework will continue to help move us forward. What gives me hope for this city, and what I hope does the same for you, when we look at how we're spending dollars and how we're allocating projects, what gives me hope for this city is that our community continues to solve challenges together. Every resident has the ability to help this community thrive, every single person. It's up to each of us. A way to think about how a community is poised to meet and address public problems is through what some would call our civic health. Communities that have strong indicators of civic health have higher employment rates, they have stronger schools, they have better physical health, they have more responsive governments. According to the American Democracy Project, civic health is the measure of the civic, social, and political strength of a community. Our community's civic strength is very strong. Listen to this definition. It's on the screen in front of you. Civic strength is characterized by the level of individual engagement and the community's capacity to work together to resolve collective problems. Indicators include volunteerism and service, group participation, charitable giving, and collective action. That is Sioux Falls. That definition is Sioux Falls. We've seen our civic strength play out over and over again, especially during pandemic, disaster response, recovery initiatives. We've seen it in action. Our community continues to work together to resolve these collective problems. Each of us, each of you have a role to play in your community to help it thrive. And that collective effort is what will move us forward as one Sioux Falls. So with that, I thank you for your time today. I am going to give the floor to Sean Pritchett, but we're going to maybe take just 2 minutes. You've got to set up, we've got to get rid of this podium, and he's going to come up and dive deeper into the 2020 current capital program. So, thank you.
That includes questions, right?
All right, I think we'll get rolling whenever you're ready, Director.
All right. Sean Pritchett, Director of Finance. I'm going to be joined by Mark Cotter, Director of Public Works, as well as Don Carney, Director of Parks and Recreation for this presentation. We're going to pivot here and talk a little bit about the current capital program year. The mayor provided a summary of the capital program that's being brought for you for 2021 through 2025. So this is a review of our current year and where we currently sit. We wanted to kind of update you on some of the projects that have been moving forward and are under construction for this year, as well as an update on some of the projects that have been set aside as a result of some of the economic disruptions that we've seen here over the course of the last several months. This slide is just a summary of the current year's capital program. If you reflect back on what we look at for the next capital program, the mayor mentioned the 83% distribution between highways and streets and utilities, and that was fairly even. You can see that we have a significant investment in this particular year relative to utilities. Many portions of our expansion of the wastewater treatment facility has been incorporated into this particular year, but will be expended or encumbered in this year, but expended over the next several years. So you can see our current budget is approximately $294 million. We have expended about $34 million. This is very early, so these numbers are only through May, and encumbered another $109 million. The budget balance is about $149 million, and you will see that this reconciles with the financial report that we will cover in the next presentation. If you look at pages 12 and 16, it reconciles to that budget, budget balance. And it's typical for us to have a fairly large budget balance, just as projects are encumbered, contracted, bid, and then eventually go to construction. I think probably more importantly, and things that we wanted to update you on, is in regard to the projects that we set aside. So a couple of months ago, as the pandemic was kind of taking hold here in the community, we did talk about some of the expectations we had related to the sales and use tax, which is that primary funding mechanism for the sales and use tax capital fund. And concerns about the potential downward trending of the sales tax, or what would happen with that in the community as a result of the pandemic. We took certain actions to help protect ourselves without not over-encumbering or over-committing projects through and bidding and contracting for them. As a result of that, we set aside about $13.5 million of that program. That consisted of, and it's just kind of as a reminder, we took $1.4 million of the capital reserve balance that we had established, and as well as the $1.6 million that we had in the capital program for a public safety bond for this year. That probably won't be in repayment for this year, so we're able to utilize that. That really hedges against a 5% year-to-date, or excuse me, a total annualized reduction of the sales taxes for the year. And then we did set aside another $10.5 million in projects, $5 million for public works, $3.5 million for parks and recreation, and then $2 million in other equipment from throughout the different city departments to help hedge against that. So kind of reflecting back to this slide, you can see for every $3.4 million that we set aside, that hedged against about a 5% reduction on an annualized basis of sales taxes. So this is where we're at presently today. As we talked in the past, our first 3 months of the year, we saw really good growth in terms of the sales taxes. As we saw a negative 2.6% growth in April, and as we'll talk about in the May monthly financial report, we saw a 13% growth for the month of May. That was a particularly hard hit month because that was April transactions, and of course that's when we were seeing a lot of the impact from the pandemic. If you look at just our year to date, we're up about 1% sales taxes year to date, and that's just based on those first 3 months. So again, if we flip back, you can see we're hedging against a 20% reduction, and currently in May we've experienced a 13% reduction. The next month will also be telling. We are hopeful to see some recovery in the reductions, although I expect it will certainly be negative still as we work to grow out of the impacts that we've had. But as you have probably visualized around here in downtown and in other parts of the city, there is improving economic activity. You can see it with the traffic volumes and so forth. So we're hopeful to see our sales taxes improve here over the next several months. With that, we continue to meet on a regular basis and making some decisions as to releasing some of the projects that we've set aside, because we don't want to be overreactive, hold projects that are necessary for the community, but also create jobs because we're investing those funds and creates jobs for contractors as well as improvements that we need for our foundational growth. As a result of that, a couple of weeks ago we met and decided to release about $3 million worth of projects. Now, we talked about hedging against a 20% reduction, and I'll go back here for a second. a 20% annualized reduction, we would have to have negative 35% growth from June until through the rest of the year in order to have a 20% reduction. Highly unlikely, so that's why we felt like given this month's returns on the sales taxes, we were able to release some projects. The most notable is the 41st Street project that we had talked about when we were talking about the surplus funds. So that project is a 41st Street overlay for about $1.2 million between Western Avenue and Minnesota Avenues. Timeliness-wise, this is an important project because we're already under construction on the Western Avenue and 41st Street interchange, and so it just made sense from that standpoint. We've also seen a positive bidding environment. So I believe this project went out for bid, I think last week, if I'm correct. So that is out. The other, we released about $1.1 million for Public Works. That is for land acquisition for future projects, as well as to begin design for other projects to make sure we can stay somewhat on track with projects that are scheduled to go to construction in 2021. We also released $500,000 for Parks and Recreation. A key piece of that was acquisition of land on the east side of the community that we've been looking at securing for quite some time. We were ready to close on it, so we released some funding to allow us to close on that, and that is a portion of the corridor looking for future expansion, allow for future expansion of the east side trail out to Great Bear. So some property along the Big Sioux River, as well as some minor improvements that are necessary with at the Levitt and in the Upper Falls Park. Given that the Levitt is not open presently, it's just a good timeliness to be able to make those improvements here prior to next year. Overall, the bidding environment has been positive. We've had 71 bids open this year to date. I think we've only had 2 that have been rejected bids at this point, primarily due to only having a single bidder. But on average, we've had about 4 bids per project, so we've had pretty good competitive activity. Overall, for the bids that we've received, we were coming in about 4% under budget. And about 68% of our bids were awarded within 20 days. And as Director Cotter would say, that's a key indicator for us, because in order for contractors to want to work with the city, they want to make sure that we are bidding and awarding work on a timely basis so that they can arrange their schedules accordingly. So that is within 20 days is real positive, considering many of those come to you for approval before they can be awarded. Similar to what the mayor showed, this is the 2020 chart of diagram of where our projects are for 2020 in the community, and just shows you the diversity in the areas that we hit all portions of the community with the various projects that have been scheduled for this year. Talking just briefly, we recently bid several projects. One is the frost boil repairs, which are important, especially coming out of winter, to making sure that we're getting those road repairs done for the community. The project I was going to focus on here in particular, as it relates to this facility, is for Carnegie Town Hall and the replacement of the ADA ramp that is outside of this facility, which, as you can see from this picture, and those of you who have utilized this, is in dire need of repair. It is in poor condition and doesn't just speak well for the facility that we have here. So this is in target to begin work in August. It should be completed by October. It will be complete replacement of this ramp. They'll tear down all the old concrete portion, replace it with galvanized steel. This project did come in under budget or under budgeted expectations, but one of the nice things about how this will be redone, in addition to providing better safety and ADA accommodations to this facility, but you also see that it will open up some of those windows in the lower levels to provide more light, and also from a safety, provide less opportunity for people to be down in those areas or be hiding in those areas. So I think that will be a key project for this particular facility going forward. At this time, I am going to turn it over to Director Cotter, and he is going to speak a little bit on some of the major infrastructure projects that are moving forward here over the course of this year.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Sean. Mark Cotter with the Office of Public Works. Yeah, we've got a few projects today to highlight. The first slide here is just to really form up for you that we've got a number of projects that are in design in preparation for the construction program of 2021. And we'll highlight a couple of these as we go through. 69th and Sycamore Avenue, this is the area that's out on the east side. We got an area in this that's seeing substantial amount of development in this area. The road is gravel today, and there'll be a substantial storm drainage component to this, but it'll essentially extend the 4-lane road east towards Sycamore, and then we'll turn the corner and go up and connect with the pavement on Sycamore. Just as we've seen progressive development out in this area, all this area has been sewered by the East Side Sanitary Sewer, and just be a nice complement to allow us to be building the arterial street with development in this area. When you're in that area too, you'll see the Harrisburg elementary schools out there. So I'm sure there's a number of daily commuters that will be very appreciated to see this hard surfaced. All right, the next one, which many people like to see, is what's actually under construction. And so again, there's just the volume of work here is the reason we put the key projects that the city of Sioux Falls is affording in 2020 that's underway. We'll hit a few of these. The A Street Bridge is the first one that's highlighted. 4th Street reconstruction in front of the Law Enforcement Center and the new jail actually had a completion date of July of 2020. I believe we're going to open it either today or tomorrow, so the contractor's actually finished early, has done a really nice job, and if you remember, we took an approach on that project to do like a streetscape light. The old road was just a very standard road. This has got bump outs in it. It's got diagonal parking. It'll really be the main gateway across through the Levitt and ultimately the Sioux Steel development. So when you get a chance, drive down that road. Let's start with Fire Station 12 on the east side of town. This is just appropriately placed. Chief Good Road is here as well. We've got 2 new schools going in, and so the new Sioux Falls Middle School will get under construction on the north side of the road. What you can see there is the new Brandon Elementary School that's under construction. You know, the Mason work is going up. In coming weeks, they'll start to put together the parking lot for this area. The anticipated completion date for that new fire station is December of 2020. All right, to go downtown, the A Street rehabilitation, the reconstruction of this arch bridge is going extremely well. The amount of deterioration is less than what we've anticipated, which is good from just a structural integrity of the bridge. If you notice that there's kind of a bridge over the bridge, what that is there's a critical cable that CenturyLink has that does not have redundancy, and so they came in, spent a substantial amount of resources to protect that piece of infrastructure and then lift it so we can actually do all the work on the bridge under it. And then once we get one of the key next steps, we'll make any repairs to the top of those arches, then we'll put a waterproofing membrane on it, and then we'll slowly start to put the utilities back on, and then ultimately the last bridge surface was asphalt. This new bridge surface will be concrete. So project's going very well. Journey Construction's a local contractor doing the general contracting work. All right, very visible project, 2-year project, the 26th Street and I-29 project. It's just under $37 million investment. The city of Sioux Falls portion of this is about 2/3 of that amount. The DOT that made improvements to exit 5 on 229 is about 1/3 of that amount. The project's going very well. It's really a substantial project for our east-west commuters. You heard the mayor mention that one of the key things that we hear at the MPO level from reaching out to the citizens is we need to continue to invest in east-west corridors. This one's particularly a big play to actually separate the vehicles from the train traffic, and the project is going very well. All right, in the northwest part of town, there's a new 4-lane road on North Marion Road to support not all the growth and development in that area, as well as the new Jefferson High School. Again, local contractor, project's going very well, and we anticipate this project will be done this fall to support the school. All right, I'll turn it over now to Don Kearney to speak to some park projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Don.
Good afternoon, councilors. Don Kearney with Parks and Rec. Yeah, we just wanted to give you a couple updates on some significant projects that we have across the park system. this year. The first one, obviously, is the Kirby Dog Park. If you've been by, you've noticed that the contractor has mobilized, they've installed their temporary fencing, pedestrian detours, erosion control measures like you'd see on a typical project. They've conducted the removals already and done some initial site grading. If you remember, Sea Dream also sits on the corner of that property. That has been relocated to our Parks and Rec shop, and so that will get rehabbed over the summer or fall, and then hopefully reinstalled next spring at Prairie Green Golf Course, where the artist really recommended that we place that sculpture going forward. So ongoing, we're working on underground utilities at the dog park site, electrical, water, sewer, also working on structural concrete for our light pole bases, and there will be shade structures, the different pillars, the park monument sign, and then ultimately we'll finish up with the concrete surfacing, the fencing, and then in this particular dog park, instead of typical natural grass, we're actually going to use artificial turf, and just from what we've seen at Spencer and some of the other dog parks, the amount of use just didn't feel like turf was going to hold up in a natural state. So we're excited to try that for the first time, and then they'll finish up with the landscaping and the tree plantings and those types of things. Total construction budget is $468,000, and it's scheduled for completion on August 14th. This next slide just talks about some of the major projects that are left to be bid. Director Pritchett and Director Cotter talked about the 41st Street Mill and Overlay project. And then the last bullet there, I'd also like to talk to you a little bit about how those bridge replacement projects are coming as a result of the flood damage that we received this past spring. So here's an example of what that Dunham Park Bridge location looks like. This is the one that we all saw floating down Skunk Creek at one point during the flood. And so we will be replacing the bridge abutments. We will be widening the bridge itself from 10 feet to 12 feet, which is really more of our standard width on our bridge. It's scheduled to bid on July 16th. The substantial completion date where the bridges actually have them open is February 5th, and then final completion with site grading, seeding, those types of things is scheduled for May 28th. The project budget is $670,000 for that project, in addition to the Sertoma Park Bridge replacement as well. And again, both of these structures will be the weathering steel bridges that you'd see across the Big Sioux River, and they're just much more durable, a lot more maintenance-free, so to speak. And so we're excited to be able to get those projects completed. As a reminder, there were several hoops to jump through because of the FEMA documentation process for reimbursement. And so we're very likely to get reimbursement on the Dunham Park Bridge, and then it's questionable on the Sertoma Park Bridge whether we get reimbursement or not because it was already budgeted to be replaced already. So we got our fingers crossed, but that may not materialize. So just wanted to give you a little update on those bridge replacement project, and also just wanted to thank Joe and Jennifer Kirby for their contributions for the Kirby Dog Park donations. So thank you. I think we're open to questions now.
Okay, sounds good. Questions, councilors? Councillor Erickson.
Probably Sean or whomever wants to answer it. I just noticed that in the projects that are in design, for example, the Great Bear Chairlift is in there as well. And I understand that's a life safety thing. I totally understand, but it did jump the list, so to speak, that was surplus dollars that were used instead of what we had originally budgeted. So I'm just curious kind of the thought process behind that, and if I think it's the Japanese garden, if that's still slated to be done in the projects and design, or if that one's going to be kind of on the back burner for now. But sure, I mean, really my intent to my question is that was kind of an afterthought and now it jumped the line. So just kind of explain the thought process.
So actually, I believe even prior to us utilizing the additional surplus funds for this year, Great Bear Chairlift was in design. up to that point. So that had already been kind of funded.
Gotcha.
What we've held back or set aside is the actual expenses related to its replacement. So we're holding off on that. That's a decision that doesn't have to be made until probably September of this year. So of all the set aside projects, it's probably on the last part of the timeline, just because we have an opportunity for timeliness in regard to that. I believe we are still holding the, at this time, the redesign of the Japanese gardens and pergola. In the meantime, we've discovered, and Don, you can certainly correct me if I'm misstating this, but more deterioration than we had originally expected in terms of like safety out there. And so moving forward with some design on that is becoming more important as we look forward. And so what we're actually thinking is, you know, after we get our next month's sales tax receipts, we'll be able to take a look at what other projects we would have the capacity to release, and that would likely, beginning that design work would be part of that, given kind of the deterioration we're already seeing, and then contemplating the actual construction work as well.
Thank you, and thanks for that clarification, because in my mind, I misunderstood how that works. So thank you for that. And I also want to say thank you for the statement that you had made about a 35% in reduction from June to December would have in sales tax month after month would then result from that 20%. And that was really, for me, it was very helpful to visualize what that would look like as far as we move forward and hitting those numbers. So thank you for that. The other thing that I would just mention, as the sales tax numbers come in, the bi-monthly did come in for March, April, due in May, and so that's probably why there was another significant, because it did take March and April in to that May calculation, as we see those bi-monthly reporting too. I know for my business I report bi-monthly, and so that could have some fluctuation with those numbers as well. So while it's not wonderful news to see those numbers down, I think that we're far better off than a lot of other states and municipalities across the nation. So thanks for your presentation. I appreciate the update.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Starr.
Yes. Thank you, Director Pritchett. I heard the collective sigh of relief from your department as we put this together, and thank you. I know there was a lot of long hours, and appreciate what your staff's done to put this together in such a timely manner and such an efficient manner. Talk a little bit about the community bond. Do we have a number? It was one as part of it. We're doing it, but is there a drum roll that goes with that, or where are we at in the process of how much?
Good question. We're literally, I think today even, I got some additional updates in terms of where the project cost estimates may come in at relative to the public safety facility, and we've received some early indications on the River Greenway portion as well as the Lowhead Dam. We're still reviewing those, you know, and kind of identifying wants versus needs and what we're able to fit in within our bond projection. At this time, you know, we essentially projected about a $50 million bond overall as part of the capital program, so that's what we've included there. We may include some refinancing as part of that as well. Those adjustments may change here or there. We want to make sure that we're doing the best improvements now, because this would be really our best opportunity to make the improvements to the public safety facility in the River Greenway. So they are still reviewing their cost estimates. We should have, I would think we'll be back here during the budget process and discussing those in more detail.
What numbers did you use? Because the mayor said during his presentation that the numbers are in the book. So,
yeah, so we utilize for purposes of the capital program, because we're developing that long in advance of when we always have the most information, but we're utilizing a $50 million bond as part of that.
Thank you.
If we refinance some of the two other bonds, there may be some cost savings. We might be able to reallocate to that as well.
Councillor Staley.
Sean, there's been some speculation within the public about where we're at with the Sioux Steel project. And as we heard earlier today, that River Greenway development seems closely tied in with what Sioux Steel was doing. So can you give us some information about where they're at?
I think a lot of people, and if you talk to the planning office, they would tell you that many commercial projects have been kind of people are kind of on a wait-and-see approach here as they're seeing what's happening relative to the local economy. Our expectation is as the economy continues to improve here over the next several months, that hopefully we will see some of those commercial projects begin to move forward. But with the banking sectors and so forth, there's, like the mayor says, we've kind of been in a pause for several months, but we still are confident in that development moving forward, and we still have our best opportunity in order to develop that property now, moving it forward so that we can get to construction next year prior to the development of that.
If that would not materialize, we would still be doing the River Greenway project?
I put me a little bit on the spot at this time, but I think we'd have to give time and considerations into that. As I said, I'm confident that that project is going to be moving forward. So I think that's a discussion point that we'll have as we get closer to the consideration of the actual bond itself.
Because wasn't that what you were looking at, between $8 and $9 million for that?
We had given early estimates, I think, was between $7 and $10 million, and we'll probably be on the higher side of that for the River Greenway because the Lowhead Dam is.
So if we, what we can and I'm probably not going to be around to have this discussion publicly up here, but we can say to the public right now that without that Sioux Steel project, the other project is probably not going to happen. I mean, I'd hate to see us start building on that and doing that $10 million renovation and then have that area just vacant.
I would say that we're going to have additional information at the time we actually bring forward the community bond here over the next several months. So
you're going to have a verification from Sioux Steel before you take that bond money out?
Consistently in communication with them about the development of that property so that we time the River Greenway improvements that works in conjunction with that.
Okay.
Other questions, councilors? Anybody on the phone have any questions for Director Pritchett? All right, looks like we're going to have you back up anyway. So you're on for the May monthly financials.
All right. I was trying to see if I stayed in that 20-minute time limit. I think we were fairly close, Councilor Sale. So even with questions, I can't make as many promises on the monthly financials, but we've got a lot to cover. And I would say with a caveat, this includes some follow-up to Governor Noem's announcement in regard to the CARES Act funding. That was kind of added to this monthly financial report to you at the last minute, but there's some timeliness concerns relative to that I think we need to discuss with you prior to some council actions that might be forthcoming to you in July related to that announcement. So with that, I'm going to roll right into the monthly financial presentation. The first slide here is, of course, our labor force and employment. Labor force continues to be fairly steady here for the community. You can see a significant drop in employment, not obviously unexpected related to the pandemic, but you do see a drop. The estimate was a drop of employment here locally in the Sioux Falls MSA by about 12,000 employees. These are the estimates that are for our unemployment rate for both our Sioux Falls, the state of South Dakota, and nationally. So nationally, at the end of April, the unemployment rate was estimated to be 14.4%. The statewide and Sioux Falls unemployment rate was estimated to be 11%. Well, I don't know that I'm necessarily in the position to be questioning the U.S. Labor Market Statistics Service or that generated these. I do have some questions as to some of the veracity of the local as well as the statewide unemployment rates, and I'm going to talk to you about why I have some questions about that. I think they do a fairly good job in a stable economic environment, but they do have to extrapolate certain modeling to estimate what our employment rate is. And I think perhaps maybe utilizing this concept that we have a national economy and that we all are moving at the same direction at the same speed. And I think other data would support that that's not necessarily the case. We certainly have experienced increased unemployment, but the data that I prefer to look at is continuing unemployment claims within the state of South Dakota versus other states. We get this more timely. This data that's shown before you is as of the week ending June 6th. And what we're seeing here is a story of multiple different economies going in different directions throughout the United States. And I've been watching these different states over a period of time here since the pandemic came into being and really took hold here locally. In particular, media tends to report initial unemployment claims, especially when they're particularly high. And while that tells part of the story, as I said last month, it doesn't tell the whole story. The real story is continuing unemployment claims, not new initial unemployment claims, because that is an indication of the severity of the ongoing unemployment claims that are occurring within the state. And as you can see here, as of June 6th, our ongoing unemployment claims were approximately 18,500. This is down from about 25,000 ongoing claims that were occurring about the month before, and this is the lowest that we've seen since the beginning of April. And you can see if you take this against the insured employment, and that, not to get too much in the micro of this, but insured employment is relative to people who are eligible for unemployment. So not everybody who is employed is eligible for unemployment, although that has expanded here over the last couple of months. So it's a smaller portion of your employment base, but it is a very good indication of what's occurring in the general economy. As you can see, South Dakota has consistently ranked the lowest insured unemployment rate in the nation, hovering around 4% currently. It's been up 5 or 6%. Now that is a significant increase over what we've seen in the early part of the year when it was less than 1%. It is a significant increase, but it is not the severity of what you might see in the regular unemployment numbers. You can see the United States is shown here to be 12%, and I believe that's realistic, and you see states like Nevada, Oregon, and Hawaii hovering over 20%. And what I've seen in some of those states here over the course of the last week is we saw improvements, and then you start seeing deterioration again. And I think what you're starting to see is the length of the closures that have occurred somewhat in some of these economies. It saw initial improvement as they started to open, and now you're seeing some of the recessionary and lagging effects in those economies starting to take hold. I think we'll see that less so in South Dakota because we didn't have the length of closure that we have here, or the severity of the economic impact that we had here locally. So the good story here, and as the mayor alluded to in his presentation, is that we do have the lowest insured unemployment rate in the entire nation. Once in a while I come across new statistics or a new article, and I like to share them with you because I think they give you context to where we're at economically as a community. And the one that I thought was particularly interesting was really related to the PPP loan program, which assisted businesses in helping keep their employees on staff. This is one of the reasons that we have lower unemployment, particularly in South Dakota. If you can take a look at this graphic here, you can see South Dakota is in the dark red, meaning that we had over 40% of our businesses eligible or taking on PPP loans, which means they were able to keep their staff on hand, which means they were not claiming unemployment necessarily, or they were being brought back off of unemployment. In fact, South Dakota was among the highest in the nation. We were over 50% of our businesses having secured this. And one of the really important things to do is to thank our community banking partners in this city, because they are the ones that made sure this happened. There's an actual direct correlation between community banking assets, the amount of it in a state, and how many businesses got helped by the PPP program. And it was done in large part because of those local banks helping our local businesses access the program. Another interesting thing I wanted to show you was this, and that is there is very little correlation between states that benefited from the PPP program and those that had high unemployment rates. As you can see, we have one of the lowest unemployment per million of anyone, and this is based on the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, but you can see we had one of the highest participation rates in the PPP program. So a little bit like the CARES Act, which I'm going to talk about here toward the end of this presentation, South Dakota has benefited by some of these federal programs to a greater extent than others for a variety of reasons, in this case access, but we had better infrastructure in our banking institutions to access this program to the benefit of our businesses here locally in the community. Inflation is another thing that we track on a regular basis, and what you will see here is it has continued to decrease over time. Last month it was 0.3%, it has dropped to 0.1%. Essentially no inflationary pressures exist within the national economy in respect to, based on these statistics. And then the Federal Reserve recently, I believe last week, predicted that they will not raise interest rates for 2 years. And since their primary focus is to make sure that interest rates do not, or excuse me, inflation does not increase, it's one of the reasons they exist. And one of the main tools that they do that is by increasing interest rates. And by suggesting that they're going to hold interest rates steady here over the next 2 years is a suggestion that not only do we not have inflationary pressure in the current economy, there is not a great expectation that we will have inflationary pressures going forward. In terms of building valuations for year to date, very much a continuing story from what we had seen previously. Overall, we're still seeing a healthy housing sector with building permits and the number of units being permitted very similar to what we saw last year. The reductions here are primarily in the new commercial. As I alluded to here in the prior question, we're still seeing some pullback or people waiting to bring forward some projects. But there are several projects that have been pending and will hopefully be moving forward here in the next several months as we see some economic improvement. But as we look at the housing stats here, as I stated, we are very similar to where we were last year, which is very positive. We see good single-family housing unit activity being permitted. We have 249 through May. That's up 2 units from last year, so essentially even. One of the good things we've seen is multifamily has rebounded significantly here over the last month or so. We are almost even with last year's number of multifamily units. That, of course, is down from the prior years, and we've talked about that quite a bit before. And townhome units are also staying very positive there. As we talked about in the prior presentation, we did have negative 13% growth on sales taxes for May 2020 over May 2019. I talked about how there are different economies across this country in ways that things are kind of reacting from state to state. We're seeing that from community to community in South Dakota as well. Overall, the state of South Dakota only saw about a 1.2% reduction in sales taxes. There are several communities around Sioux Falls that actually saw an increase in sales taxes receipts for this last month, where we saw a reduction. I think part of that is you have to look at some of the sectors of that, and what experienced growth and what experienced decreases. Similar to what we had seen before, we've seen significant increases in remote sales. And we have to keep in mind these are April transactions that we receive in May primarily. So remote retailer sales, as people were staying home, were up 86%. Lumber stores, department stores like your Targets, your Walmarts, your grocery stores, those were up about 7 to 8%. We saw strong manufacturing, which is very good to see. Gas stations, again, were up. Liquor stores, again, were up. Real estate managers continued to be up, and that's something that we saw the prior month. What we did see on the negative side is more sectors going into negative territory and more significantly. Most of the ones that were most significant, again, are not unexpected. Restaurants, apparel, lodging, amusement services, as people kind of curtailed or held back their spending or were unable to be consumers of our local retail establishments, you did see dramatic reductions in many of these areas. But there is also opportunities for hopefully many of these to rebound, some certainly more than others here over the next course of the next several months. Wholesale trade goods was down significantly. I wouldn't read too much into that because it was particularly high in May of last year, and the actual numbers for May of 2020 were consistent with prior months. So while that shows that being greatly negative, I don't think you can read too much into that. Entertainment tax collections were down significantly. We were down 24% the prior month. We were down 47% in May. One of the themes that I will have when you talk about sales taxes and entertainment taxes, they are down significantly, but the story is better than what we were necessarily modeling. We've been modeling up to 60% reductions in entertainment taxes because 50% of that tax is generated by restaurants, 10%, slightly less than 10% is generated by lodging, slightly less than 10% is generated by bars, and many of those industries were significantly impacted. So we still are withholding about $3.5 million worth of projects within the entertainment tax fund that we're holding back. We have not released any of those. As we continue to hedge, we'll be watching that one very closely because our expectations is recovery of that particular fund or the revenues within that fund will be much slower. Property taxes, I think Councillor Staley, you asked about this in the previous presentation. So May is a big month in terms of property tax receipts. It's when we receive, you got your first half that people typically pay, and those are when we receive them from the county is in May. So the question is, did we see any material changes in timeliness of payments for property taxes? You can see here in through May of 2020, we've collected about $29.3 million in property taxes. That's up about 1.2% from where we were last year. We were at $29 million over the last couple of years. So it's not quite on par with our growth expectations for this year, but we were in a similar position last year, and we met budget last year for our property taxes. So there is some fluctuations that occur there, but the one thing we did see also is, in addition to the numbers you see here on the screen, we collected $400,000 in delinquent taxes that happened to be paid through May of this year. That's up 57% from the prior year, almost counterintuitively that we would be receiving such a significant increase in payments for delinquent taxes. So what I can tell you from this, based on the revenue data that we have, is that we're not seeing any material changes to behaviors in regard to payment of property taxes, and we don't have necessarily any concerns relative to that at this time. There's no indications that we're seeing any major delinquency in regard to that. Two areas that we are seeing obviously some significant concerns, and this does not impact the city necessarily because it is a wash for us, but we do collect lodging tax receipts and bid tax receipts on behalf of Experience Sioux Falls, our local visitors bureau. And they are an important part of our community in terms of attracting and bringing people and supporting our local lodging sector, which has been particularly hard hit. This is very telling of what's happening in our lodging sector. You can see here that we dropped below $20,000 in receipts for May of 2020 for lodging taxes that were received. That is down approximately 81% from May of 2019. So very significant reductions there. If you look at the bid tax, a very similar story being told there, substantial reductions there. May bid receipts were about $100,000 less than May of 2018 and May of 2019. So you're seeing significant reductions. You're seeing occupancy levels in May, and most of these were April numbers being recorded in May. One thing I want to point out, May is when typically these revenues would be going up, not down, trending in this direction. We rely heavily, our lodging sector does, on the key summer months, and they're seeing some very significant reductions there. That puts pressure on that part of our economy, but it also puts pressure on the CDB as well. There are some promising, hopefully some promising indications that are occurring with the lodging, but I expect it will take some time. One thing that I would point out is, average occupancy in May of 2020 was about 30%, I believe, and that was done on ADRs that were our average daily rates, significantly lower what they usually charge. So they were charging lower rates on fewer rooms. So this has been a challenged sector of our economy, certainly one that we want to continue to do what we can to support our visitor industry, and I think that's been a large part of the Spark initiative, which Councillor Kiley and Councillor Erickson, you both have been a part of that. As far as our overall general fund revenues year to date, our revenues are about on pace with where we've been in the past. We actually have collected about $1 million more in totality with all revenues in consideration than where we were last year at this time. We're about 42% of our budget. Last year we were about 43% of our budget, but we had a very good year last year, and we actually came in at 103% by the end of the year. So not a great deal of concern so far. We'll be watching the next several months closely, but still, primarily year to date, we're in a fair solid position there. You can see on the expenditure side, we're about 33% expended for the year. We're being about 42% through the year. Very typical. We were about 35% expended as of last year. We're essentially have spent about the same amount of money as we did last year, although our budget was larger for this year. You are seeing some impacts from reductions in staffing, holding positions open, not hiring seasonal staffing and part-time staffing. And I think we'll continue to see some of those reductions in the months ahead. Also, a big factor here is a $2 million less spent on snow removal in the first part of the year that we had in prior year as well. I do want to kind of look forward here a little bit in terms of revenue expectations. So again, we're going to be watching our revenues, sales taxes in particular, closely in the months. In the next week or week and a half, we should have some additional information in regard to that. We'll be sharing that with you. as it becomes available, as well as the additional data that we've shown, not just in the monthly report, but in our emails to you also. I do want to talk a little bit about the CARES Act. As you're probably aware, Governor Noem was here yesterday discussing a local government assistance program that is being implemented through the state of South Dakota. This is part of the CARES Act money that they received. So the state of South Dakota received $1.25 billion through the CARES Act. And they've been holding those funds as they've been deciphering what those funds can be utilized for. Certainly the state and many others had been hoping to have a little bit more wiggle room, you might say, to use it for lost revenue as opposed to some of the other eligible costs that had been determined. But this law was passed fairly quickly by Congress, and it was not with a lot of guidance per se, and there's, as fast as it was ruled out, not a lot of regulatory procedures given the emergent needs of the states at that time. So the funds were given out, and the guidance from the U.S. Department of Treasury had slowly been coming and evolving over since that time. As a result of that, state of South Dakota has announced that they are taking $200 million of the $1.25 billion that they've received and will be utilizing that as an opportunity for cities and counties to be able to access those funds. Whether the full $200 million will be utilized or not will depend on what the eligible costs are that the various cities and counties are able to bring forward. I do want to give you some context though. Again, I talked about with the PPP program how the state of South Dakota benefited significantly by the way that program happened to be structured as well as the infrastructure. We had to get the funds out. We benefit from the CARES Act program as well. So the $1.25 billion, that translates into about $1,400 per person in the state that the state received. If you look at them comparatively to other states throughout the country, more populous states, they received about $365 per person. So we received about 3 times as much per capita as any other state because we received the minimum amount, which was $1.25 billion. So we did benefit greatly as a state from that, particularly as a state that maybe wasn't as directly or negatively impacted as other states. But that brings forward the question of how those funds can be utilized. And I'm discussing this today because there is a timeliness factor. We will have to come forward with a resolution and request the council's approval to be able to access these funds before we can move forward at all. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the eligibility is on that, but I do want to stress a couple of things. One, this is one-time funding for COVID-19 related expenses. This is not a substitution for or a replacement of any revenue sources. And in fact, it is expressly prohibited that this be used for revenue substitution. So the fact that our sales taxes are down is not evidence that we can use to support requesting these funds. We have to have what they term to be eligible costs. Now, I believe that U.S. Treasury has attempted to go above and beyond as much as possible to give the broadest interpretation of what eligibility would mean for these costs. But I do want to talk to you about kind of what that means. So essentially, it was announced yesterday that the city of Sioux Falls could be eligible for reimbursement up to $41.5 million. Can we achieve that amount of funds and eligible costs? We're continuing to assess that. It is what they're going to allow and not allow continues to change a little bit over time. The state has provided some guidance. The U.S. Treasury has provided some guidance. The state's guidance is a little bit more restrictive than the Treasury, so we'll have to go back to the state and ask them on certain other items, which I think they have been open to, allowing eligibility for. But so this will be a back and forth process. Obviously, we just got the information yesterday, so we have some time and some work to do in terms of what we'd be able to utilize. But what I don't want people to assume is that we're automatically going to receive $41 million. We will be working to try to maximize the amount that we can get back from this particular program. It does require an authorizing resolution from you as a council to move this forward. The state has given us a template resolution to pass with the council and hoping for only minimal changes to that resolution, hopefully, because they have many hundreds of communities that would have to pass this resolution in counties. It does require a grant sub-recipient agreement. I'm going to talk about some of the requirements in that, but that will be provided to you along with the resolution so you can see what that agreement looks like. But the resolution essentially authorizes the mayor to sign that agreement on behalf of the community. So you have an opportunity to look at that. And then we have to fill out a risk assessment. This is a very minor item for us. It's essentially just asking whether we know how to handle federal funds, and we do. As a community, we've done that quite a bit. And so there will be no issues with that. So here's the key part that we need to talk about, and that is one of the provisions of these funding is that it cannot be in your already approved budget. That is as of March 27th, 2020. So any supplements that were made after that date are not bound by this. So that's a little tricky, and this is where the open to interpretation kind of falls into play that the U.S. Treasury has tried to give us some guidelines to work within. It also can only be for expenditures between the month March 1st and December 30th of 2020. So unless this is extended, those expenses have to have been incurred and paid by December 30th in order for it to be reimbursable through this particular program. Now, the challenging part is many of our expenses related to COVID related to redirecting resources as opposed to things that weren't originally in our budget. And the way that the Treasury has essentially given some guidance on this is to suggest that, for example, if someone who is working for the community ended up having to do something substantially different dedicated to the COVID response, that payroll or that cost of that person's payroll and benefits may be eligible under this. So an example I might give, and one that we'll be working with the state is, Director Eckhoff had a planner that was devoted full-time to the EOC for probably 6 weeks, 4 weeks, something of that nature, where he was doing full-time work for the EOC, doing data work and so forth. GIS department, similar to the same thing. If he hadn't been doing that with the EOC, he would have been doing his normal job, which is processing, various portions of our planning, zoning portions of his responsibilities. So one could ascertain that he was substantially different than what our budgeted funds had anticipated him doing, and that is how they're kind of providing some wiggle room, per se, into that viewpoint of it can't be within your approved budget. They also provided guidance to say that public safety personnel, which our state has essentially defined as law enforcement and emergency managers, those individuals, as well as public health personnel, you can assume for administrative simplicity that they were substantially dedicated to fighting COVID, which is it's a different term than what they used relative to the budget provisions, but you can see the nuances that are occurring here, that if they were substantially dedicated to COVID-19 response, then maybe they were substantially different than what you had budgeted them to do, and therefore they would become eligible for reimbursement. This is very important because it potentially opens up our public safety payroll to reimbursement. And that could be the most potentially significant portion of what we could receive through these funding. And we will need that type of sizable eligible expenses in order to maximize our return on the CARES Act funding. Other things that they said have been eligible are PPE, isolation centers. We did have other grant funding for the isolation centers, but we had personnel that was dedicated to running them that weren't part of that grant. We might be able to receive funding back from that. Public health and public safety payroll, as I stated previously, cleaning supplies, equipment and software support, and remote work. By far the largest component of that would be payroll, if we're able to tap into that and bring back and utilize that as eligible expenses. It is on a reimbursement basis. We must document the expenditures and submit them to the state for reimbursement. Not atypical to many of our federal grant requirements, although since administered by the state, I think it will be a little less burdensome than, say, FEMA or some of the other ones where we've been years into we're still not finished with last year's disasters in terms of getting reimbursed. So we expect this will be a more timely process. The one thing that is important for you as a council to give consideration to is that we are at risk of repaying these funds if it is deemed in the future that the costs that we deem to be eligible are deemed by the federal government to be ineligible. And that presents a certain degree of risk for us, especially when you're talking about a sizable amount of funds. And so as we move forward with this, and we should move forward with this and taking advantage of these, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that there is some risk involved if they deem, especially with the limited amount of guidance and the robust amount of flexibility that we're given, that interpretations won't change in the future and that they won't try to peel back some of those fundings. And so we have to be careful when that funding comes in to understand a couple of things. One, that we have the capacity to manage a reimbursement if it should occur and how we would handle that and still maintain financial sustainability. And we have some thoughts on that. These will be further discussions for us down the road. because at this time, thinking about how these funds will be utilized is pretty premature. We're going to need to see where our sales taxes come in for the year. We have to see how much we would actually be eligible for funding reimbursement, and see where we end up for expenditures for this year. And we'll know a little bit more about whether this funding helps to better, I guess, our account balances to the extent that it could be utilized for other purposes. What I would suggest, and I would leave you with, is that people don't have the interpretation that this additional funding will be available for ongoing expenditures. We cannot take unexpected one-time funding from this and expect that we could incur an encumbrance that is going to cause an expense to the city for many years to come without an expectation that we have ongoing revenues to support that. So an example I might be is an expansion of FTE, of hiring people that we normally wouldn't, if not but for the fact that we think we have additional funding. Because it is one-time funding, it's not supported by an ongoing revenue source for the community that would support the expenditure long-term. So those will be some of the things that we'll have discussions about later in the year when we have more, better information as to how much this pandemic piece has cost us in terms of revenues and where we end up for account balances. But I do want to kind of do that, bring forward that concept that this isn't really supportive of ongoing expenditures. And we do not anticipate including any of the COVID or CARES Act funding that we receive as part of our budget request for 2021 because there's too much unknown about it at this time. So, questions?
All right, Councillor Staley?
A few questions, Sean. The property tax revenue, good news to hear that it's still in the 29 million range, but you said it wasn't quite, the 29.3 million wasn't quite what you expected.
Well, not what we quite expected, but I think we estimated in our budget something like a 5% growth factor for property taxes, and we're up 1.2%. But I want to be clear, we were also not at our amount of growth last year at this time, and we ended up very much on budget with property taxes. So there is some variation that occurs when people pay their property taxes and when we receive them.
Well, and that, yeah, that's really wonderful news that citizens are still able to come up with the money for that. And that would have been in April, correct?
Correct, yep.
Okay, another question, talking about the money possibly coming from the state. So I've got a few questions on this. First of all, would we be eligible to be reimbursed for I believe it was $1 million that we put into that rental assistance program?
That's a good question. So based on the eligibility guidance that the state has provided, they did not include that as an eligible expense. However, that type of expenditure was specifically identified in the federal guidance as being allowable. So that will be something that we will be speaking to the state about, whether we can allow that to be a reimbursed expense. It appears to have been that under the federal, and then the state will have to see if they agree with that.
And then I know you and I had a discussion about, and I think I saw this in the Argus Leader, the cleaning supplies. And was it 200,000 we spent on that, or was that 150? It was a number
It was more than that. I was thinking it was more than 300,000, and that was all PPE, cleaning supplies, PPE, and that was everything combined.
And at the time you said that this could be reimbursed.
Yeah, we were expecting that we probably would have went a FEMA route. This will be a much simpler route than FEMA. So we would definitely take it on the state side rather than through FEMA.
So, okay, and then do you have an idea? Oh, you're talking about, you used Jeff Eckhoff's employee as an example, and are we talking about Jason Bieber, or who was that who was working? Albert Schmidt. Okay, so the question I would have is that, okay, so Albert's working in the operations center, doing his thing, and we're going to get reimbursed for something. Did you hire somebody to do Albert's job within the city then?
No.
So I'm not understanding where the harm is.
That's a very good question. It's really an interpretation of what the federal government will interpret to be an eligible cost to be reimbursed under this. I will say that the state of South Dakota desires us to be able to take as much of the funding available as possible. So we will work within those confines to do that. But as far as hold harmless, not necessarily, but for many of the staff that were repurposed, they would have been working on other things. Everything got delayed because everybody's attention turned to this specific.
Right, everybody, things were, we got what, librarians mowing lawns and stuff like.
And I want to be clear, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's not entirely clear that the state will follow that guidance in terms of the repurposed pieces. That will be a discussion point we have with them.
But I think I need to make a statement that at the end of the day, it's all tax dollars. Whether it's coming from the federal government, the state, it's taxpayers' money.
Correct.
And we're giving we're going to get another stimulus check apparently. And I'm thinking to myself, gee, you know, what's this going to be doing to the Social Security system? Yeah, you only and I know you don't have the answer to that, but when we're getting all these, you know, $40 million bonuses, it's like it's really coming from somewhere. And so thinking, we always talk in our city about the long-range planning, and I think when we look at long-range planning for the millennials, people, you know, is there going to be any money left in that system to help people with that, Medicare, Social Security? So
Those are very important questions from a federal perspective, yes.
Other questions? Councillor Sale.
Thank you. Director Pritchett, I got a couple of quick observations on your presentation and one question. You talked about the insured unemployment, covered unemployment, how South Dakota is statistically low. The point is we don't cover as many employees' occupations as other states do. We're a little bit more stringent on what is eligible for unemployment. Second, you talked about how the PPP has been received in the state of South Dakota and the great job our community banks have done. I want to make the observation they were paid for that, so I would hope we would see the larger bank franchise fee come in as a result of that. My third point on something you said about the Fed not raising interest rates, they've indicated not raising interest rates for 2 years. In the environment that we're in today, 2 years is an eternity. So I certainly would not invest my own personal money based on the fact the Feds had said they were going to do something for the next 2 years. My question is page 6, you talked about the entertainment tax collections. You also mentioned that 50% of that comes from restaurants and places, establishments. I know that there have been establishments that have closed or are currently closing or are not reopening. Do you have any indication on what percentage of the restaurants that fund this tax will be back in business versus what was prior to the COVID?
We don't. I mean, the best we can do is to follow the sales tax receipts that we see and see what the recovery rate looks like, but I haven't seen any indication in terms of how many of those businesses won't be coming back. I think PPP has allowed many of them to hopefully survive some of this impacts. The question is, what does the next several months look like if economic recovery doesn't occur quickly enough or people don't become comfortable enough to be patrons on site for those particular establishments? So it's hard to say because I think we're kind of in a period of somewhat, with the PPP, some of them have been supported with that. What will happen when PPP expires and they no longer have that source of revenue, and will we have recovered as a part of that? I think those are good observations, but I don't have a good answer for that.
Thank you.
Councillor Neitzer.
I guess the first thing I would say is I guess I would probably want to be conservative in what I'd ask for reimbursement if there's the threat of a clawback. I
think we're going to be very careful in working with the state. So if other certainly if we're not going to go, I mean, they're going to make some determinations themselves as to what they deem to be eligible based on their conversations with U.S. Treasury. So it's not as if we're going to say, well, we think it's eligible, and they're automatically going to concede to that. They've been looking at the guidelines as we have, and so there is going to be that additional layer of supervision as opposed to that. But ultimately, they're going to be responsible for the funds, which they're going to make us responsible for. So we just have to be careful as we look at it too.
Yeah, it's kind of like if in doubt, I don't take the tax deduction as an example. In terms of you need to document the expenditures, obviously that would be presumably for an audit. So is this just something that would fall under like our annual audit where they're randomly looking at different federal grants and things?
It'll be considered federal, so it'll hit that threshold of if they have to give additional review of certain federal grants as part of our audit process. So yes, they'll consider it federal money.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions, councilors? Anybody on the phones? Okay. Yeah, maybe Councilor Staley got into this too a little bit, but like some of this may be ineligible when you get down to the other, you know, you might write a check and then later you don't get reimbursed. It's the same thing with the PPP program where I sometimes go, yeah, it should be forgiven. We're not sure, but we should, you know, are guidelines with this kind of there where you kind of know, or?
And the guidelines are changing. I think the guidelines are in a far better position than they were a month and a half ago when the program was first introduced, and now the state has a better idea. There's potential that they'll change the guidelines. Are we at high risk to have the funds taken or clawed back? I think it's a fairly low risk. I think at least the present state of our federal government is they're not interested in taking the money back or trying. I mean, the idea was this was to help support and buffer our local communities, but you always had that risk, at least for a certain number of years.
Right.
So we just have to, like most things when we do a federal grant requirements, to do it prudently and make sure that we apply some level of common sense to what we request. So.
Sure, makes sense. Well, thanks for all the presentations today. Nice job.
Mr. Chair, can I
Yeah,
sneak
go
in
ahead.
one more? I forgot to write it down and I couldn't remember what my question was, but you reminded me. So one of the things the Treasury Department talks about in a lot of their guidance and recommendations, or at least what they have available on their website, is schools. How did schools fare in this? And there's also some talk about retraining as well. So, and in combination with that, our housing program that we did, we could extend or potentially add more money to that program that would be eligible. So
we could add more money if they deem it to be eligible. So the state will have some, the federal requirements they have, but it will be under the state's whatever guidance they give us within that construct. If they don't deem it to be something that they want to have to be reimbursed, or they're not comfortable with reimbursing, then we wouldn't be eligible for that. As far as like school district and so forth, there's some provisions in the federal guidance, as you said, for things like distance learning, or, I mean, there's a lot of little nuances within the regulations that basically state, you know, if time was fully dedicated to develop distance learning, but not for actually executing distance learning. I don't know what the status is of the state considering additional funds for other portions or other entities other than cities and counties, though.
Well, I think one of the things that you stated is so true, that this was put together at the last minute. And I think you see a lot of municipalities also run the school districts around the country. So there was some assumption that the money that was going to municipalities, I would have, God, I hate using the word assume, but that they were thinking they were covering some of the school district expenses as well. So I'd like to see us at least work with our counterparts if that's part of ours that we can't use, or if there's something that works into it as well with the state that it makes sense, whether it's the technical institutes and job training and people who are displaced because of COVID. I mean, you can see the industries that were affected pretty easily through this process, and where that unemployment is, if there's some job training that goes along with this as well, that people can continue on to what we're doing, if it's to a point where it's we use it or lose it type of thing, that we can be creative in this process too.
I get the sense that I think we're going to be limited to just our eligible expenses by the state, with the broader guidelines of can you transfer to other governmental entities, or can you fund some business development or business support structures. I think the state, if those are moved forward, the state wants to move those forward on a consistent basis statewide, as opposed to having every different municipality do something differently. So I don't expect, based on the indications I've gotten, that the state is going to let us expand beyond just servicing our own eligible costs.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right, we've reached the public input portion. If there's anybody here that has any comments on today's topics, and our clerk wanted to do a quick, who is on the phones today? We haven't heard from anybody, so just double checking for attendance.
Councillor Kiley's here.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. Well, I think we'll adjourn, and we won't see you at 7.